I think we're going to get started. We'll try to be on time, set the tone for the rest of the day. Aren't you glad it's miserable outside so you don't have to pine for a sunny day? And aren't you glad you're not in Hawaii trying to dodge lava flows? I wonder, hopefully they won't be concussed. So this is our sixth annual symposium on concussion. We actually started our program on concussion research about 8 or 9 years ago. We have 7 PIs who have been with us from the start, 7 of our principal investigators, and about 20 others who are involved in concussion research. We are also running concussion clinics at several points at UHN. Carmela, Richard Wenberg, myself are involved in the concussion clinics. TRI, there's another concussion clinic. We dedicated this conference to the families who are suffering from the burden of concussion. It certainly drives home the fact that this is a significant public health concern that was neglected for so many years, neglected in terms of research and in terms of prevention, awareness, recognition of concussion, but it's quite remarkable how that has changed. Even this week, I was asked to give a talk to 1,500 general practitioners at the Prime Med conference on concussion. So the information is really getting out there. And last week at the Niagara Summit, there were over 400 teachers who attended that summit. That would never have happened 15 years ago. And so we are seeing a gradual increase in awareness and concern about concussion. It is really achieving its role as a significant issue. Unfortunately, the research has lagged behind quite amazingly, so has been left fallow by the traditional research. And that also is being corrected by organizations like ONF, Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, and also by Ontario Brain Injury Institute, so that these organizations have embraced the importance of concussion, and it's now included in their areas of interest. Our own efforts in concussion have been aided by many organizations and individuals, but in particular, our hospital foundation has helped us scrape together a few million to run our concussion research efforts here. We've had some major gifts. Carmela Tartaglia, who will follow as the chair, as one of the 2 chairs for today, along with Robin Green. Carmela holds the Soloway chair in concussion research. I'm particularly proud of that because it's the first chair in the country, maybe in the world, in concussion research. We have an advisory board that's been very active in helping us out, and I see several members of our advisory board here. Leo Ezrins in particular, the CFL Alumni Association has been a major aspect of our work, believing in the cause and coming forth with alumni who want to be involved in our research effort. The families who have participated in our work, Kathleen Haggart is sitting in the audience, so thank you, Kathleen. Her daughter was concussed a few years ago, unfortunately made a very good recovery, enough of a recovery that she was able to fund through her efforts at fundraising the first Concussion Fellow in Canada. So thank you to the Haggart family. The agencies that are listed in your program that have helped us, the corporations, are all there. We get help with this symposium from the NHL, the NHLPA, the CFL, OBI, and I'm missing one. ONF. So thank you to those organizations for supporting this symposium. And we yesterday had a public forum at which there were over 100 people to try to provide the public with general knowledge of concussion. And we had our partners presenting, OBI, ONF, Parachute Canada, and we had an excellent discussion on the full spectrum of concussion as it affects families. We have two great keynote speakers today who we worked very hard yesterday as well, and I know how excellent their deliveries were yesterday, and they'll be in action today as well. So I hope everybody has as good a time today as we had yesterday. So Carmela, please come and chair this morning's session. Carmela is an associate professor at the University of Toronto in neurology. She has, as I said, the first concussion chair, and she has major interest in neurodegenerative diseases, and of course that is an important aspect of concussion research.
Thank you all for being here today, and gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker who came all the way from Glasgow yesterday and made it in time. Dr. Stewart leads an internationally regarded research lab engaged in multiple programs that are investigating the pathologies of acute and long-term survival from TBI. Working with the unique and comprehensive Glasgow TBI archive, which you'll hear about and is extensive, and this is in collaboration with colleagues internationally. Dr. Stewart's research describes the complex neuropathology of TBI across a range of injury exposures and survivals. In addition, he directs the field study into lifelong health and dementia risk in soccer. Reflecting this activity, Dr. Stewart acts as expert advisor to multiple sports organizations and national governments, which contributed to the Scottish concussion guidance for all amateur sports in Scotland. Dr. Stewart.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Carmela, and again, Dr. Tata, for the invitation to come and speak at this fantastic meeting. I've been here for not quite 24 hours, but I've thoroughly enjoyed the interactions in the various meetings so far, and it's great to be back in Toronto, a city that I spent some time in as a young man, as a trainee. And also, Scotland and Canada have a lot in common. I think we're very similar people, and actually, even the weather today is very Scottish. It's what I would describe as dreich, which is how I like it. But one of the things we have in common is we're desperately trying to improve not just the research level, the kind of lab end research in concussion and brain injury management. We're also trying to translate this into decent public health practice. And one of the things that we're fairly proud of is our pan-sports concussion guidance, where we have one set of guidance and instructions on management of concussion, no matter what sport you're playing, no matter what activity you're involved in, which is endorsed by all our sports organisations, universities, royal colleges, and also government. And it's simple as, if in doubt, sit them out. And this is for amateur sport. So there's no rocket science in this, it's just, if in doubt, sit them out. And actually, I was really impressed yesterday at the publication. I'm going to take this back and see if we can't come up with a similar hard copy version that we can use to try and promote this with our patients and families back home, with the concussion information that's just been released here. But one thing I'm sure you're aware of is it's all very well having these great documents and great guidance. You need to make sure people actually open them up and read them. So I'm diverting actually from the talk slightly, but yeah, I'm first up, so I can do what I like. And my own personal experience illustrates the need to have people read these things. This is me about 18 months ago, not in the lab, but in the ward in my hospital, having been knocked off my bike on the way into work by a passing car. I spent the usual several hours in the emergency room being scanned from top to bottom, and you can see there I have the evidence of physical injury because I have a plaster cast on this arm with a fractured wrist. I have various abrasions, and I still had bits of car windscreen in my hair. I don't have much hair, but I still managed to capture some windscreen on the way past, and abrasions on my face. I also have other injuries which subjectively the clinical teams could identify because you can't see it, but I had multiple pelvic fractures there as well, which is what really delayed my recovery in some ways. But as far as everybody was concerned, my brain was top-notch, working fine. CT scan normal. Nobody really seemed to worry too much that I had no recollection of the events, that I was confabulating crazily, that I was actually, one of my students passed me as I was lying in the street and helped out with the sort of first aid, and said it was like meeting me a drunk in a pub. Now, I've never actually been drunk in a pub, to reassure you, but you can imagine that was how he described it, which is not me, certainly not on the way to work. So concussion at that point, not diagnosed, took a couple of days to figure out, and the rest is history I won't go into. But just this picture I show for a reason, because in the guidance and in our guidance it says don't use electronic devices. Now here am I, Dr. TBI, in a bed in the ward. I didn't know I had a brain injury, and I would have told anybody who asked me I didn't have a brain injury. I would have got back to work if I could have. Just damn pelvis was slowing me down. And look what I'm doing. I'm sitting within the first 4 hours on my phone emailing people. And the emails are actually very revealing, and the people getting them at the other end were quite worried because they were gibberish, absolute gibberish. So it's all very well having the guidance, but if you're emergency room doctors, if you don't read them yourself, then you're in trouble. Okay, back on form, back on topic. The question is, do almost all athletes have the degenerative brain disease? And if so, why do we need pathologists? The reason being is that if you know anything about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, other than what you've read in the New York Times, you'll know that it's a diagnosis that can only be made after death, which is what we always say. It can only be confirmed, can only be made after death. And yet, in this study, which was reported in the New York Times, 110 out of 111 former NFL players had degenerative brain disease. So surely, to diagnose or to find patients with chronic traumatic encephalopathy with CTE, you don't need a pathologist, you just need to stand on the pitch side anywhere and just point. Because 99% of players surely have a degenerative brain disease, according to this study. And this is the dilemma we're in. Is it really that prevalent? Is there really this much of a problem? People reading these stories would see it that way because they can't necessarily work their way through the statistics and the data and figure out that this isn't necessarily the whole story. But I'll try and, in the next 20 minutes, half an hour or so, give you some insight into why we maybe just have to reread this and step back a bit and actually be really responsible with our reporting. And this isn't a problem that's unique to the US or North America. It's also a problem we're seeing increasingly in our sports at home. I describe this as proper football. This is, or you might call it soccer, but proper football. where we're seeing headlines suggesting that the football, the sport, is involved in some sort of conspiracy to deny the obvious, that there's degenerative brain disease in the sport. I'm slightly responsible for this study saying that heading produces immediate effects in the brain. I'm not going to discuss it today, but I'm happy to do it afterwards. And then there's a study that suggests that a most detailed study ever showing that there's a dementia problem related to heading. I'll discuss that in more detail. So this issue around sport and its handling of head injuries and dementia is not something unique just to football in its North American sense. So let's just think of how this talk's going to run through. The question is, if almost every athlete has CTE, why do we need pathologists? And that's a question that I've been asking myself. And the background to that, I guess, to try and understand why we still need pathologists is does CTE exist? I mean, this is a question I get. These are questions I get asked all the time, which is why I've made a talk around it. Does CTE exist? What is it? What is the evidence linking it to brain injury, if any at all? And really, do almost all athletes have CTE? Can we just stand at the side of a pitch and point outwards and say, that one? So, CTE. If you go to the movies and you've seen this film, you'll know that Will Smith plays Bennett Omalu, and one of the lines is, "I found a disease that no one has ever seen before," and clearly that's not true. It's just a disease which had been described in a new place, and that new place was in somebody who had participated in American football. And the story is of Bennett Omalu, who was working as a forensic pathologist in Pittsburgh at the time, and had just done his neuropathology boards and knew something about degenerative brain disease when he came into work to find Pittsburgh Steeler Mike Webster there for autopsy. And the story of his decline made him think, this sounds a bit like something I remember studying quite recently for my boards, which was a boxer's dementia. And I just wonder whether there's something inside this man's brain which is actually degenerative and structurally abnormal, which might explain why he had this decline. And so he, given great credit, went to great lengths to examine Mike Webster's brain, and found in the brain that there was fluffy deposits of amyloid protein, these brown blobs there, and also neurofibrillary tangles within neurons, again this brown material here, composed of a protein called tau. And so he thought, well, this is dementia pugilistica, but it's not a pugilistica, it's not a boxer, this is an American footballer. The world needs to know this. And so he published this, thinking that actually people would be pleased to hear this, because now we're beginning to get a better appreciation of the effects of brain injury. Of course, that's not what happened. There was an instant reaction from people within the game of football, which made life quite difficult for Bennett, and I think probably still does. And that's the subject of the film, bless you. But what he described was a condition which we'd known for some time, and that's why he was able to recognise it, because he had this knowledge that there was a degenerative brain disease associated with brain injury. And this condition used to be known as a punch-drunk syndrome. Again, something described by a pathologist. Pathologists are key throughout of this. Apologise for this. We're responsible for all the worst things in the world. Harrison Martland in 1928 did a clinical study of former boxers and described the punch-drunk syndrome. And you can imagine what that might be. Boxers who are a bit slow of thought, a bit unsteady on their feet, punch-drunk syndrome. Actually, in that paper, there's some really nice pathology as well, which isn't really dementia pugilistica, it's about brain injury, but if you ever get a chance to go back and read the paper, it's worth a look. It took some years before we really began to understand the structural changes in the brain, the pathology in the brain, that might be correlated with this punch-drunk syndrome. And this was work by Carcelis, who had a fantastic archive of material in London. Some of it still exists. And he looked at the brains of some ex-boxers, and he described some structural abnormalities, and he also looked down the microscope and could see that there were abnormal protein depositions, which is essentially what we recognise now as CTE, although in those days he didn't have the same technologies and staining procedures to be able to make the most of it. And one of the structural abnormalities that he described is this thin membrane in the middle of the brain, the septum pellucidum, which in many of the cases can be wide open or cavum, so it can be split in two, or in other cases like this, it can just be full of small holes, fenestrated. And actually, this is one of our recent rugby players. And I mean, going back when I was very early in training with Professor David Graham as my mentor, we used to travel to Glasgow City Mortuary to do forensic brain cuts, and we would discuss the case. This was an assault. This was a man who was found, lying dead in bed at home. and we make that first cut through the brain, through the mammillary bodies, just here, and that slice through the brain, and we would see an abnormal septum pellucidum, and David Graham would have great pleasure turning to the forensic pathologist and say, was he ever a boxer? And occasionally the answer would be yes. How did you know that? Because this is such a useful indicator in this kind of pathology. Now, it's not unique to boxing, it's not unique to exposure to brain injury. You can see it. Some people in this room may have a slight cavum, but it's a useful clue. But where have we come to in the last decade or so? Well, in the last decade or so, from something which was kind of fairly poorly recognised, really only seen in boxers, very few of us really understood what it was we were looking for. We used to see occasional boxers through the Glasgow practice, as I've said. We've come to a point where we actually have sat down as a community of neuropathologists and tried to define exactly what this pathology is, define exactly what the disease should look like down a microscope. And this is us in Boston several years ago. Anne McKee, who's led much of this work and certainly accrued a large case series. But I think it's important that, although this is talked of often about these formal criteria for diagnosis of CTE down a microscope, it's based on a very few cases, only 10 cases of CTE in this review. And these were selected cases of later stage disease, so cases where the pathology was kind of typical and fairly easy to find, as opposed to a real challenge. The real world of pathology is nowhere near as easy as consensus meetings. And the pathology we thought was useful to look for was this clustering of this brown material, which is abnormal tau protein stained for microscopy, at the depths of sulci. And it seems to hover around blood vessels as well, and it's in neurons and supporting cells, the glia, the astrocytes as well. So this seemed to be a distinctive pattern pathology which you didn't see in other places, or we don't think you see in other places. The whole point in a preliminary, a first run consensus, is to define what we think the criteria are, and then put it out in the real world and have it torn to shreds. Have people put it into practice and come back and say, that doesn't work, or I find this instead, can you refine it? So again, this pathognomonic lesion is these p-tau aggregates, these phospho-tau aggregates around small vessels, and this patchy distribution, this funny distribution. But importantly, these are just preliminary criteria. Okay, we've got a long way to go to make more sense of it. And the reason they're preliminary is partly because of this. In the 90 years since Harrison Martland first described the punch-drunk syndrome, the first boxing pathology was around about the mid-50s, and it described a kind of degenerative pathology. The Carcella series, which is really our seminal series, which describes much of what we're actually looking for now in dementia pugilistic or CTE, came in the early 70s. Bennett and Malu's case was 2005, and then we've got the preliminary neuropathology criteria for diagnosis of CTE around about 2016. But this is a cumulative numbers of cases reported in the literature. And by the time we get to present day, we're only around about 350 cases. It's difficult because some cases are reported 2 or 3 times, depending on what the paper says. But we're around about 350 cases in 80, 90 years of trying to understand this disease. This is a vanishingly few cases. So we can't possibly be at a point where we actually understand what this disease looks like, let alone how we go out and try and find it in practice. But we're at a very good starting point. And I think a bit like this curve, we're on an exponential upslope. You know, this knowledge is going to rapidly advance. And I've talked about tau, but if you really want to kind of get your inner pathology geek satisfied, go off and find that paper, because we also recognise that it's not just that abnormal tau protein. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the brains of people exposed to brain injury, not just athletes exposed to repetitive brain injury, but also people exposed to one single moderate or severe brain injury. Some of those too also demonstrate significant degenerative pathologies. And it's not just this tau pathology. There's inflammation, there's vascular abnormalities, there's amyloid pathology, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well. I shouldn't tell you this, but you'll keep it to yourself. In all our research, we anonymise the slides, mix them up, and I look at them blind. The research group looks at them blind. But to be honest, I've looked at so many brain injury cases over the years that I can put a brain injury slide stained for virtually anything or not stained at all, and I can identify it as brain injury because they just look really, really grotty, for want of a better word, down the microscope. They're really quite diseased and damaged brains. Okay, brain injury damages the brain, and it does it over a long period. So how are we moving this forward to try and get a better understanding of the range of pathologies and refine that preliminary criteria into something which is a bit more functional? Maybe we'll just confirm that it's the same criteria. Maybe we'll just reinforce what's been seen already, or maybe we'll take it in a different direction, or maybe we'll improve on it. Well, I'm now part of another group through University of Pennsylvania with Doug Smith and John Trojanowski, looking at, and Lily's joining us in this group now as well, looking at a wider series of pathologies. We looked at 10 to begin with. Now we want to look at 30, 40, 50, and by the end of this year, possibly 100 or more. I don't know, it seems to be growing all the time, and that's important. We need to see more. Also in this group is a guy called Eddie Lee. We'll come back to Eddie, but just remember his face, okay? You're going to meet him again. So, does CTE exist? Yes. Okay? If anybody asks you, does CTE actually exist? Yes. There is undoubtedly a pathology, a neurodegenerative pathology associated with brain injury, and it's fairly distinctive, and I can recognise it. So yes, it does. What is it? Neurodegenerative disease, formerly thought to be dementia pugilistica. The tau pathology gets the headlines. The tau pathology is the thing that people take photographs of or create these pictures in the New York Times of. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in those brains as well, over and above tau, none of which I would necessarily want. Okay, what about the evidence linking it to brain injury? I actually, these are the headlines that we see related to sport, and almost every contact sport has met this, where somebody at the top of the sport has said something and it's been reported in the media that they're denying there's any link. And I kind of feel sorry, actually, because this is bad advisors, not necessarily, an irresponsible comment. I did a lot of work with World Rugby some years ago and encouraged them not to go down this line of saying, and essentially what I think he said, and I'm only reading what's in the headlines there, and I'm only reading what's in reporting. I think what he said is not his place to say what the relationship with brain injury is. He's not that smart. It's down to scientists. And that's probably fair enough. I mean, he's a businessman. But actually, what he could say is, we're really concerned about this. This is something that we're going to work on. Until we know more, we can't possibly, provide comment. But we're worried about our players. And that's kind of what we did with World Rugby. We had them acknowledge that there was definitely something worth exploring, and there was probably a lot more work to be done with it. And meantime, the welfare of the players was the most important thing they could work on. And that's, that's a responsible attitude. So I kind of feel for them. I mentioned this last night, and it was really I set it up for today. So I had a Twitter poll, because that's where you get your best data. Twitter's, I love Twitter. Best science comes through Twitter. If it's not on Twitter, it's not worth reading. So I set up a Twitter poll asking, does brain injury modify your risk of dementia? Something like that. And the options were yes, no, need more data. Okay, so I'm going to ask you all to respond to that, because I don't think you all replied to the Twitter poll. I got about 100 responses. There's more than 100 of you here, so some of you didn't reply. So I'm going to ask you all. And if the answer is yes, you put your right hand up. Hang on. Or were you just twitching? If the answer is yes, you put your right hand up. So yes, brain injury associated with an increased risk of dementia. If the answer is no, you put your left hand up. And if the answer that you'd like to give is we need more data, you put both hands on your head. Okay? I'll not even say both hands, just both hands on your head. We need more data. Okay, so on the count of 3, have you got that? It's not very simple. You're Canadian, you're smart people. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, please all vote now. Yeah, okay, that's interesting, actually. That is very interesting. You can put them down now. It's probably about the same result as we got. Probably more towards the brain injury is associated with dementia than I got from the poll. The poll was well, last night, some of you, I think, did actually go on and change it. But last night, it was roughly 49% said yes, 49% said no, and a couple of percent said we need more data. It's changed. It's about 6% want more data now. And again, I still think I could probably name many of them. Let me just try and see if I can convince you some more. So these are all the instances where CTE has been described. All the instances where it's been described thus far. Okay? And the only common denominator I can find in those various instances is exposure to some form of brain injury or brain impact. There's nothing else that unites these people. Actually, I meant to mention it last night, but one of my rugby players with significant CTE, he was a most unusual rugby player, and we were discussing the culture of rugby at various times yesterday. And he's a most unusual rugby player because he didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't live a happy partying life. He was a church elder who was teetotal and had an occasional cigar when the children were born, sort of thing. And yet he's got extensive CTE. Also, the other one that's raised is alcohol. Alcohol. Maybe this is just a feature of alcohol because a lot of these athletes are involved with alcohol. Well, my counter to that is I've spent the last 18, 20 years working in Glasgow in neuropathology. And if it was a feature of alcohol, trust me, I would have been reporting it long before now. We see an awful lot of people with alcohol, and I don't see this pathology related to alcohol. I do see it in people with brain injury. So brain injury seems to be the common uniting factor at the moment. And there's always been a bit of a problem looking back at literature in retrospective series, but there's been a bunch of really nice studies in the last couple of years looking at population figures, clinical health records, and trying to figure out if people who have a history in their health records of exposure to brain injury have a different instance of dementia to what you'd expect from population. And I just picked a couple, just two of the more recent ones, not particularly because they're particularly strong science, just because there were two more recent ones. And this is a Scandinavians study. Anna Nordstrom actually works for UEFA as a kind of an additional job. So she's I really like Anna. But they looked at the population in this Swedish study. Control populations and matched individuals, so they look at demographically matched patients or people within the population. And the expectation for dementia rate was around about this black line here, and the dotted line is patients or people who had an exposure to some form of brain injury. And so what you see is the incidence of dementia has increased in that population. And they actually went a wee bit further and looked at moderate, severe brain injury or non-mild brain injury and mild brain injury, and then time from that injury to diagnosis of dementia. And in both instances, in the first few years, the risk of dementia goes up, and that's probably related to the older population who are probably on the verge of dementia, tumbling over and developing disease. But actually, even when you go out beyond that, to the kind of 40-odd years or more in moderate severe brain injury, you're still seeing an increased risk of dementia in that population. It's kind of tailing off a bit on a single mild. This is a single mild being hospitalised mild as opposed to sports mild. But let's assume that we're talking about brain injury here beyond just sport. And this one actually just came out last week, and I was on the way to Westminster to give a talk about brain injury, and so I pulled this one and just threw it in as well. This is another population study looking at American military, and in this occasion, there's your non-brain injury exposed, there's your mild brain injury with no loss of consciousness, with a loss of consciousness, and then you're beginning to up the ante to moderate or severe brain injury. And again, what we're seeing is a shift in the curve from the normal age-associated instance of dementia towards the left to earlier onset and increased risk. Okay, now you can pick apart various bits of these studies, but the bottom line is that there's increasing data, more and more studies, population data, reinforcing the fact that a brain injury, moderate and severe, mild, hospitalised, in some people can lead to a modified risk of dementia. Okay. Let me just talk briefly about taking it away from just brain injury, talking about just brain impacts, because subconcussion comes up a lot. And this again is about responsibility and reporting, and why sometimes the media can just get a wee bit ahead of where we are with the science. So this was a study by my colleagues in Queen's Square, reported in the media as the most detailed British study concludes condition is related to heading. Okay, let's just break this down a wee bit, because that's pretty damning on football. What it was an observational study over 30 years where a psychiatrist in Wales with an interest in dementia and liked a bit of football just happened to pick up patients coming through his clinic with dementia who were footballers. And in a 30-year experience, he encountered 16 former footballers. Now, I don't know, one footballer every 2 years, is that a lot? I don't know. How many plumbers did he see? How many rugby players? Wales is much more rugby playing, so where's the rugby players? So I don't really know what that means in terms of instance, but and whether that's a major finding or not. Of these, he followed up 14 for a bit longer, and 6 of them ended up with a post-mortem. So here's the table, and there's a lot of data in this, but I made it easy by highlighting the important data. Of the 6 that had post-mortems and neuropathology examinations, 4 of them had CTE. 4 out of 6. So we've gone from 30 years, 16 patients, 14 followed up, 6 got post-mortem, 4 got diagnosed with CTE. Brain injury exposure in these patients, or these players, maximum 1 concussion, maximum 1 injury with loss of consciousness. Now, there may have been others, but from all they could get from retrospective review of the case records, they could only find evidence of 1 exposure to a concussive type brain injury in 5 of them. So that's not repetitive mild brain injury, that's single. So you need to come up with another explanation. Okay, the other explanation is it's exposure to repetitive subconcussive impacts. So it's just, is there a cold going around? Repetitive subconcussive impacts. So heading a football is subconcussive impacts, and this is where the logic comes from. So they didn't have repetitive brain injury, they must have repetitive subconcussive impacts. That must have been what did it. It's the heading a football that does it. Well, hang on a second, how do you leap from such a small number and such limited data to damning an aspect of sport? I'm not saying I'm a particular fan of heading footballs. I'm not a fan of football, to be quite honest, but again, we'll keep that amongst ourselves. Interestingly though, one of the players who didn't have CTE, and this is going back a bit in the days when people used to get involved in different sports, was also an amateur boxer. So what does this tell us? Here's an amateur boxer and a footballer who heads the ball, who's also had at least one loss of consciousness playing football, and he doesn't have CTE, but he does have Alzheimer's pathology. So what it tells us is that maybe we're focusing too much on a single pathology. We should be thinking in wider terms about degenerative brain disease and people exposed to brain injury. It's not just one story. Going back to the American football reporting, where 110 out of 111 of them had a diagnosis of CTE. Well, hang on a second. If I do 111 dementia postmortems at home, I'll find a lot of Alzheimer's disease. I'll find a lot of vascular disease. Where are those? Where are the American footballers with Alzheimer's disease and vascular disease? Potentially modified by brain injury, and that's what we're beginning to believe. So Eddie Lee, remember Eddie in that picture? So Eddie Lee's a really smart guy, and I like him, and he and I we're actually emailing back and forward on something this morning, but that's another story. He came up with this idea that we need to think less about just coming up with a single unified diagnosis. We need to actually, this is what we're doing on oncology now with our surgical oncology cases in neuropathology. We're thinking about all the different things. What's the clinical diagnosis? What are the pathologies we see, listed one after the other? What are the molecular changes? What's the other information we have? And then finally, what's the integrated diagnosis? So if you take all that information together, what's the best fit? So it's not a single diagnosis, it's the best fit diagnosis. So here's one. This is, again, just two recent cases from my desk. 59-year-old male, former soccer player. Histologic classification, overwhelming CTE, some amyloid angiopathy, very common in these players. Clinically diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, molecular don't have any information on. My integrated diagnosis in that would be CTE. Okay. If I was to give them the main diagnosis to think of in terms of his pathology, I would say CTE. But the amyloid angiopathy is there for people to read and consider. Here's another case. 78-year-old male ex-rugby player. Both these players, by the way, had clinical diagnosis of dementia. 78-year-old male ex-rugby player. Histology had high stage Alzheimer's disease. He also had something called aging-related tau astrogliopathy, which is kind of a newish entity. And he also had a bit of CTE tucked away in the corner as well. And I took a lot of blocks and found some CTE. Clinically, he was diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, much like the footballer. And again, molecular, we don't have data on that at the moment. And actually, this one, I would say, integrated diagnosis is Alzheimer's disease. I would say that from taking all the information I have, Alzheimer's disease. Okay, CTE is not my trump card, that I'd find it in one block, in one sample, in one field, in one focus, in one photo that I can put in a journal and call every case CTE. It's just a pattern of pathology which I find in the context of the constellation of everything else going on. So, evidence linking brain injury to CTE. Thus far, we're really only seeing it in people exposed to TBI. In repetitive mild, certainly that captures the headlines because sports men and women athletes are people that capture headlines, but it's also there in the community in other places as well. Actually, in that Westminster meeting, the politician Chris Bryant, politicians are interesting people. I'm happy to mix with, not you guys are great to mix with, but other people who aren't necessarily as academic, shall we say. Politicians are interesting. And the politician, Chris Bryant, is a really, really nice guy, but one of the questions he wanted to know was, so what does this cost? What does this cost? What does this cost? The community, society, because it's a political argument. How can we spin this to benefit? And actually, it's very difficult to quantify, but many of the best studies, and actually there's a Danish study which I didn't show, suggest that around about 5% of dementia in the population, 5 to 10%, depending on who you read, of dementia in the population currently is a cause of or modified by exposure to brain injury. 5 to 10%. Now, in Scottish terms, that's £26 billion per year. In UK terms, £26 billion per year is spent on dementia care. Okay, let's say 5% of that, about £1.5 billion per year spent on care in a dementia which might be preventable or at least modified in some way. In Canadian dollars, that's about $3 or $4 million. I've no idea. The pound's worth nothing. The pound's worth nothing, so who knows? So, why is it there in every single player? So I mentioned this briefly yesterday. We've been trying to kind of understand that if this is such a prevalent problem, playing contact sports, exposure to brain injury, is causing such a problem, we should be able to find it. If we go out and look for it, we should be able to find it. So, and I apologise that the text on this is small, but don't worry about it. I'll just run through it. So we looked at some retired rugby players, internationalists in Scotland. Now, rugby's not only been a professional game for just over 20 years. So to get people who've been exposed at the highest level, non-professional, we go back to the internationalists who played at the highest possible level and were training at a level above, even in those days, above your average amateur. So we went to the retired internationalists, and we found some men who were essentially retired international rugby players but had never played rugby as control. So they were everything. They were them. They were from the same areas, had done much the same things, drank in the same golf clubs, but just didn't play rugby. So weren't exposed to brain injury. And we really, really drilled down deep into how their brains were functioning. And at the end of lengthy inquiry, we found that what we could detect was subtle change in fine motor control in the dominant hand. But something that none of them came in and reported. None of them came in and said, how are you feeling? How's your brain functioning? Well, I can't pick up pins. It's a terrible thing. I'm crippled by this. None of them reported it. We also found a very, very subtle change in memory performance, but again, nothing that was clinically relevant. So what we found actually in looking at retired rugby players is we couldn't find any real evidence in this group, and these are about mid-50s, that they had a significant impairment of brain. What we did find, though, was that they had considerably lower levels of cardiovascular disease than the control, suggesting that having that high level active participation in sport is a good thing in terms of lifelong health. May not be a good thing in terms of dementia. I'll come on to why we may have to pursue this further, but it's a good thing in terms of lifelong health. So we don't want to lose participation in sport. We don't want to lose people engaging in sport because of this fear of a guarantee of getting degenerative brain disease. We can't do that. We need to be much more responsible in our reporting. I mentioned this last night, and I'll gloss over it, but essentially this was reported in the media rather as a kind of disappointed headline, like, no, only mild. Try harder. Go out and find more. And actually, this is recapitulated in other studies as well. It's not just unique to our findings, but and this is kind of another busy slide. In the aspects of it in the American football, the NFL level, there's a study from some years ago suggesting there was a higher incidence of dementia. But again, the players, what's not reported is that their general health in retirement was better than people who hadn't played in that level of sport. So there's this health benefit there. And in a high school study which was published last year, again looking at population data, looking at that kind of wider population against expectations, couldn't find any obvious problems with the cognitive functioning, but did find general health was a bit better. So I think we need to kind of just, again, bring back to the study that at the moment, when we are at this point of reporting 110 out of 111, we've got one, a pathology population, and two were at very early stages of this disease. So let's try and put this in context. Where does this 110 and 111, how can we explain it? Well, I think this is one explanation for it, is that in the entire world's literature, we're about 350 or so cases in almost a century. But in the media, in one outlet, New York Times, there's almost as many articles in CTE. So I think this is something that the media reporting is considerably further ahead than our understanding in science. And that can be quite, we need to keep that in mind. Every time we have a conversation, and I get regular phone calls from radio and TV and various other places who want to, have an interview or discuss something, we need to keep in mind that whatever we say is going to be reported, and the reporting can sometimes be challenging. I'm not saying that this is wrong, but we need to just keep that in mind. And the authors would acknowledge that this is what they call a convenience sample. These were patients who are players who the families felt there was something that they wanted to be explored and wanted to be pursued. So this is a skewed sample. This isn't necessarily all American footballers who passed away over that period of time. So this isn't really a true epidemiological study. But if we say that over that period of time, let's assume that the sample they looked at is every single American footballer with disease, out of all the players who died over the period where they were collecting. Do you follow? So they just happened to, by chance, capture them all. The argument is, well, if we take that line, that means that 9% of former American footballers will have a degenerative brain disease. And I have put to me, that 9% is a terrible figure. 10%, it's a terrible figure. Actually, population level dementia is around about 10% anyway when you look at the numbers, so it's probably not that bad. But as I say, we created these criteria for people to take out into their archives and do a bit more work on it and see what they could find. And actually here, what we found is that this is again Queen Square looking at a dementia archive and looking for pathology of CTE amongst other dementias and seeing how many times they could find it. And actually, I've highlighted the important figure there is controls. Now, these aren't completely normal individuals. These are controls who are cognitively intact, okay, donated as controls for a dementia brain bank. And actually in controls, known cognitively intact, they found CTE pathology in about 12%. Okay, small numbers, but nevertheless, about 12%. So compare that to 9% at the worst case scenario from NFL. It doesn't actually sound that that's too bad. Now, somebody's going to challenge me and say, I thought you told me that it's only been described in exposure to brain injury so far. Now you're telling me controls at 12% have it. Okay, hands up here. These controls, when they went back, looked at them, almost all had exposure to brain injury where they could get the information. So it holds true. And their controls and their brains were functioning normally or not known to be functioning abnormally when they died. So then now we get two things. We've got a pathology which might not necessarily mean your brain's not working okay, and we've got a pathology which is possibly prevalent in the population around about the 10% level. So we need to then factor that into our understanding of, what does this mean for sport? We need to know more than just recording pathology series. So again, how we're going to try and tackle this, and it was mentioned briefly, is in this football study. This is a documentary you can find on the BBC channel with Alan Shearer, who used to play for England. And this is the what we call field football's influence on lifelong health and dementia risk. I understand for this population it should have been soccer's influence on lifelong health and dementia risk, but sealed sounds ridiculous, nor can you put a nice cool grass graphic behind it to make it look like field. And what we're doing here is a population study in former football. It's a bit like that military study, a bit like that Swedish Scandinavian study. We're doing a population study. So we're looking at former professional footballers in Scotland that we've got a large database of and that we can identify from our electronic health records that go back to 1980. And we're going to match them up with people from the population from as near as we can identify their group. And we're going to look at what their risk of dementia is against that population. And also look at lifelong health, because I'm really, again, conscious of responsible reporting. We don't want to just say they have a 3 or a 4 or 5-fold modified risk of dementia. We need to understand how they're living otherwise, because if there's a halving of risk of cardiovascular disease in the west of Scotland, that's a phenomenal impact on public health. So we need to know more about what's happening in these places so we can balance the risks, so we can understand how we package this requirement for change in game if it comes along. So, final slide, and then I'm actually finishing with time for questions for once. Do almost all athletes have CTE? I think we need to really be honest here, and there's multiple biases in the samples. There's bias in sampling, there's biases in the way that the cases come to us, there's bias in the ways that we report them. I don't get brains donated to me in former rugby players or football players or boxers who were functioning at a high level normally in the community. I, like all pathologists at this point in time, get brains donated to me in people who had issues and the family wanted to get in touch. The people who do sign prospective forms and say, in the event of my death, please take my brain for donation, generally are younger people who are going to live for longer than me, and so we don't tend to see them. So this is a sample where we have to acknowledge there are biases, and we have to be really honest about that. This isn't a cross-section of the entire population, this is a biased sampling. So we need to get better at unbiased autopsy. We need to be asking people those hard questions in former rugby players who are functioning well, who are perhaps at the older ages and may come to donation. We really need to see your brains. We need to see your brains, and we're working hard to encourage people to do that. And we also need to acknowledge that, as it currently stands, our understanding of the pathology in this is preliminary. I keep saying that over and over because we don't really have a full understanding of the full complexity of the pathology in people who've been exposed to brain injury. Nor do we really know how much of this pathology is required to make a diagnosis. So is one patch of abnormal tau that fulfills the criteria for diagnosis enough to say that patient has CTE? Or are we just seeing a pathology? So where does this pathology become clinically relevant? And I'm always really careful that what I describe is pathology, not disease or necessarily dementia. It's pathology that we describe, and it's smart people in clinics that can turn it into what it means clinically in families. We need to know what the association is between brain injury and other dementias. We're fixated, we're focused on CTE, but there's a whole bunch of other dementia there as well, and I suspect a lot of that is modified by exposure to brain injury too. It's not just a simple brain injury causes one pathology, one dementia, and that's the end of the story. There's other things happening in people's brains as well, which we need to understand better. And so we don't really know about the incidence of CTE in the population, nor whether CTE is the only thing that happens after brain injury. So with that kind of rapid run through everything I'm up to at the moment, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Time for a few questions.
Good morning. I'm not a medical professional, so this might be a dumb question.
No such thing.
There's also been a lot of use or discovered use of performance-enhancing drugs, especially in the NFL, anabolic steroids, all those kinds of things. Has there been any kind of link or study trying to determine if that has any effect on
it's a really, really good point.
Like Mike Webster, notorious steroid user. Like he admitted that. Like that was used notorious.
And that's a really good point. I think that in that slide where we bring up all the instances where CT has been described thus far, the only common denominator amongst them all thus far is exposure to brain injury and brain impact.
Right.
Now, clearly that's not the only thing that can modify risk of this dementia. And there must be other things happening in life as well. Or if it were just brain injury and brain impacts, then 99% of people would have it. I'd have it. You might have it. So there must be other things that happen in people's lives as well. Now, drugs and alcohol are ones that come up regularly, perhaps, but that doesn't explain them all because, again, that rugby player had a really clean living life and
right.
He still developed CTE. So it doesn't by any means excuse or explain all the cases that are out there, but it may be something that we can look at as a contributing factor, like we can think about genetics, like we can think about diet, like we can think about a bunch of other things as well. So I think this is the challenge now going forward, is to take what we understand with exposure to brain injury and begin to unravel the other confounding factors, the other contributing factors which might modify this risk. Because it may be, we do a really good job with challenging brain injury, but we could do a quicker job with other things in terms of modifying risk. It's a good question.
Thanks for a great presentation, Willie. A question about getting high-functioning people to contribute their brains. How do you propose, or how will you track their medical history to be able to compare that to others? Because it's as I found out, and through Dr. Tatter and others, it's a tremendously tedious, complex, expensive activity to go back and get all the comparables that you need. How do you do that?
So so there are two ways to do it. You set up the complex and tedious and challenging study to recruit people, say our rugby players that we did the study in, and follow them every few years from now until they pass away. And that's the kind of study that does need to be done. But that is phenomenally complex and time-consuming, and it's the kind of study that will probably report long after I retire. The other way you can do it is we're really fortunate. I don't know what the Canadian health service is like, but we're really fortunate in Scotland that it's a small enough community and we've got a health service set up that every medical interaction that we have is stored electronically and it's sent centrally. So we can do these big population studies, and that's been on the go since early 1980s. So if I should pass away when I go home and I've donated my brain for research, the researchers can actually just, in a couple of key clicks, have all my clinical data downloaded and available to them in an anonymised fashion, but it's all available. And if I sign the consent saying, by all means, de-anonymise it, then the information is there. So we can do that to some extent. And of course, there's limitations because it's down to adequate coding and adequate storage of information, but it's there in a large population.
Good morning. Perhaps a comment from Dr. Tatter about one of the assertions you made was that CTE was not found in people who had who did not have as a risk factor some form of traumatic brain injury. I thought that Dr. Tatter's group had described someone who had not had exposure in their lifetime to traumatic brain injury and yet still showed CTE pathology. I'm not sure what the clinical picture showed, but perhaps Dr. Tatter can elaborate on that. And
and this is where, you know, having defined the criteria and sending them out now to be challenged in wider diagnostic services is really important. And I think what I would say is that although even in the study from Queen Square, where on the surface they found, you know, controls, people who were normally functioning who had pathology, all but one of those they could find a history in the available case records of exposure to brain injury. And that last one, it's not that the history of exposure to brain injury wasn't there, or they didn't have exposure to brain injury, they just couldn't get the history. So I think is an element of, we may all have exposures that we don't necessarily have recorded in our case records or necessarily that the family have written down. Actually, my getting knocked off my bicycle on the way into work isn't in my case records because nobody in the hospital made the diagnosis. And yet for 2 weeks at home, I literally had no idea what I was doing and couldn't maintain a conversation. And
it's a little surprising to accept at face value that no one, despite your confabulation, despite your confusion, had identified any degree of brain injury.
Oh, I mean, my wife had, my med student had, my colleagues who received emails had, but my orthopaedic surgeon who was looking after me hadn't. And actually on my discharge, as they came round for the ward round, which involved throwing the hand in and saying goodbye, goodbye, I said, look, I don't know if I should mention this, but my recollection of the incident is wrong, and I've got real problems with memory, and I've got a terrible headache. And his colleague that were doing the handover said, "Oh, you may have a concussion." So a concussion is, and he started explaining it to me. At which point, his colleague sort of pulled him aside and said, "No, it's fine. He knows what that is," and that was it. But it never appeared in my case records. My general practitioner has now documented it because there were, I mean, no, it's not for, we can talk about it outside, but there was some significant problems for a few weeks. Where
Dr. Tatter, can you comment?
Actually, I prefer if Lily commented because she was the first author of that paper.
Well, yes, we presented the case last year here at the symposium. The presentation clinically was ALS, basically. So clinically pre-mortem, it was thought that it was a case of ALS. And I happened to do the pathology, and it had pretty much the pattern of tau with the perivascular and quite extensive, and also involving the spinal cord. So I have not good explanation for it, but I think it just brings out the fact that in most of our neuropathological studies, we have to include a wide range of controls to really look into to refine better where specifically we see this perivascular tau pathology.